Centennial Campaign is perhaps the most important thing the Albright is doing or has done in a long time. 2025 marks 100 years for us in this building, and it is a celebration of that 100 years of pursuing our mission as being a nexus for Israeli, US, Palestinian researchers coming together in the shared pursuit of research excellence. In order to be here for another 100 years, this Centennial Campaign has a very deliberate mission, which is frankly to boost our endowment. We live off the interest on our endowment. It means we can be here and keep the lights on. And as you can see, the campaign is going tremendously well. We're about to hit, I hope, our first goal of 2.5 million US, and we will then hit, hopefully, or reach our secondary goals following that. This is tremendously important because it means we can sow that back into our endowment and keep doing what we do so well. We draw on the generosity of all of our Albright community, both big and small. And if you are interested in making any donations, please come and talk to me. If you're interested in just making a donation via our webpage, you can go and find the various links. You'll find on there, apart from a portal just to donate, a choice if you would like to purchase a brick or an engraved brick with your name or somebody's name on there that you would like. We'll create a grotto in the garden of named supporters, and they're $250 per brick. So bear with us on this Centennial Campaign. It's going to be around for the next 18 months or so. And we will have at the upcoming AIAR conference a special workshop on the Albright and its achievements over the last 100 years. And as part of this Centennial Campaign goes on, I thought every time I make an introduction over the next year or so, I'll take one of these plaques that are around the campus and talk about some of the donors on whom we have relied so strongly. And I'm going to start with Richard J. Shaw, Dick Shaw, whose plaque you'll see as you come into the library. Dick was a long-term trustee of the Albright, particularly during the years of Cy Gitten's directorship. He was a very kind of muscular, active trustee. He was in and out of the Albright frequently, involved in all sorts of the operations, whether it was sitting down and chatting with the cook to facilities development, all that sort of stuff. It's Dick's financial support that really underwrites the Albright today. In 1984, he and a colleague, Joy Ungalaida Mayerson, initiated that endowment fund with a donation of $300,000 US. That was 1984 dollars, and that provided the foundation stone upon which we've really built this house that Albright built. Following several other donations over the next few years, in 1998, he donated $500,000 US to the library, hence the plaque that we have here now. And I mention Dick in particular because we are very fortunate that his grandson was hoping to come today. I don't know if he's here yet. Adam, have you arrived yet? At some point, Adam might turn up. His grandson, Adam, now lives in Jerusalem with his wife, Shreya, and have been in and out of the Albright. We've been talking about the achievements of his father. Dick died in 2008 on November the 10th. And I'll just share briefly a description that Cy Gitten penned in an email correspondence with Adam the other day, where he said that Dick was a truly remarkable individual whose support of the Albright was grounded in his love of the archaeology of ancient Israel and his desire to further the involvement of the working relationship between American, Israeli, and Palestinian academics. Whenever he was in Jerusalem and able to attend one of the Albright lectures, he would always ask one of the most intelligent and relevant questions. I can only say that I was most fortunate to have known him. It's a lovely sentiment. So we'll visit one of these donors over the course of the next year or so. Right, but into the guts of the presentation today, which is the site of Khirbet Ghozlan. This is an archaeological site in the East Rift Escarpment of Jordan, where I've been working for the last couple of years. Are there any more chairs available? Andrea, there is some space if you wanted to come and sit down.
Some chairs here, please.
Yeah, I think we're hanging up coats. It's okay. Hey, no. So what I'm going to do this evening is bolt through fairly quickly these kind of three sections. First of all, we'll look at this site of Khirbet Ghozlan and look at how I think it operates in time and space, particularly in its period of the early Bronze Age and how that relates to its settlement and the landscape. We'll then take a step sideways and look at the archaeological signatures of olive oil production and then review those based on the evidence from Khirbet Ghozlan. And then I'll take a step backwards, I guess, and reflect a little largely on how Khirbet Ghozlan operated in the landscape as what I think is a specialised, seasonally occupied olive oil production and temporary storage site. So that's the roadmap. Just to introduce you to the site, Khirbet Ghozlan is this very small site. It's only 0.25 hectares in size. It sits atop a small knoll, and that is on this large wadi system called the Wadi Rayyan. You'll also see that as the Wadi Yabis, draining the East Rift Escarpment of the Jordan Valley, basically from the highlands of Ajloon down towards the mouth of the Jordan, towards the Jordan River, where, say, the mountain site of Pella sits. Now, if you stood on top of Khirbet Ghozlan and looked west towards the Jordan Valley, you're just south of the mouth of the Jezreel-Esdraelon Valley. So that's the kind of area that we're in. The surface pottery from this site, which was first surveyed in the 1980s by Gaetano Palumbo, dates to the early Bronze Full period or the intermediate Bronze Age, depending on which side of the river, but we're talking much the same thing, essentially the second half of the 3rd millennium BCE. And the site is kind of characteristic. It's typical for this kind of period, small, rural, scrappy bit of nothing, except the fact, you can see it here, that the whole site is defined by a large enclosure. And where this site connects to a ridgeline behind it across a saddle, the access point, that enclosure wall is large. It's built double row of very large, megalithic kind of monumental slabs, probably controlling access to the site. Which begs the question, for such a small, scrappy, titchy site in the middle of nowhere, well, why the hell would you go to that effort to defend such a small site? And that's kind of the driving question that, that boosted us into this project in the first place. So if you look at the site in aerial photos, you'll see a Google Earth image taken in 2016. You can see that enclosure wall coming around the knoll. That enclosure wall actually traces around the same contour, enclosing about 0.4 hectares, but occupation is only limited to the sort of the top third, so about 0.25 hectares. The whole thing would fit pretty much into the courtyard of the Albright Institute. In 2016, the Apami Aerial Photograph Project, this is a project run out of Oxford in Western Australia that takes aerial photos of sites in Jordan. They're tremendously wonderful colleagues because every time they have a season, they send an email out saying, we're about to head off in our helicopters. Is there anything you want photographed? And if it's on our way, we'll take it. And so they took that photograph and it was wonderful because we got a much clearer picture. And it showed that the site had been partly destroyed by that bulldozed farmer's truck. It's that since then has grown, and it's a farmer expanding along this side to plant a new olive orchard. So in 2016, I'd been watching this site for some time, and I thought, well, if we're going to do anything, we've got to do it now because the site's survival is precarious. So we're able to get an emergency excavation permit off the Department of Antiquities in Jordan, who were very kind. And then we turned up to do some excavations. Now, just before we get to those excavations, a bit of Khirbet Ghozlan in context, time and space. In time, I'm going to use the early Bronze 4 vernacular here as opposed to the intermediate Bronze Age. One isn't better than the other. I'm just more used to saying it, so bear with me. We're talking the early Bronze Age, and we're talking really the end or the bum end of the early Bronze Age. Now, the early Bronze Age, I think, is the most interesting period we could possibly study. Slightly biased, although strong accolation from Elliot Braun, not surprising on the floor. The early Bronze Age is that period where you see urban or proto-urban systems and settlements flourish for the very first time in the southern Levant. Archaeologists, because we have no imaginations, have divided into 4 periods, which is called the EB 1, 2, 3, and 4. And basically, towards the end of the early Bronze 1 period, you can see on the time bar at the front, we see increasingly complex villages and towns develop into centralized, well-defended city sites or early proto-urban sites, or what you will. These are sites with palaces and massive temples and massive fortification systems, international trade networks, and it really flourishes from the end of the EB1 through the EB2, EB3, and then something happens to this early urban experiment. Doesn't happen in the northern Levant, doesn't happen in, say, Syria, northern Lebanon, where these systems go from strength to strength. But something happens in the southern Levant where these systems stutter, shudder, and then collapse. Now, this isn't kind of a zombie apocalypse collapse. This isn't people screaming and much wailing of gnashing of teeth. This is more a kind of gradual collapsing on itself over the course of several centuries. I think of it in my mind's eye, you know, imagining I'm in the International Space Station, looking down at the Levant at night, and you're just seeing the lights of all these cities, and then one by one, they're slowly going out until the entire population has sort of shifted into much more smaller, rural, village kinds of ways of working. Why that collapse happens? Well, that's a whole different lecture. You basically put 3 archaeologists in a room and you'll get 4 different opinions and 5 broken limbs, but it could be to do with climate, it could be to do with incursions from the Egyptians, it could do with changes of trade, and particularly Egyptian maritime trade routes. We'll go into that some other time. But within that, the early Bronze 4 period, the IBA, this is the period, the so-called Dark Age, as it was once upon a time called, a period of ruralization, as we would call it now. Somewhere in that period, I'm not quite sure where in that fairly large time bracket, but somewhere in that, people turned up at that Khirbet Ghozlan knoll and said, I think we could put an olive oil factory here. So this is how we look at this period of ruralization in the landscape. First of all, you get a proliferation of small, undefended, rural, scrappy sites, kind of like Khirbet Ghozlan, mostly less than a hectare, some a little larger. There are some kind of medium-sized sites, 3 to 4 hectares in size, that continue to be built upon the ruins of the much larger sort of ghost towns of the early Bronze cities. There are a handful of very large sites. These are all new foundations. These are all around 20 hectares. And they're all located in the Jordan Valley at the mouth of the main tributary rivers that drain the eastern escarpment. So Shah Galan, Tel Hamad, Iktinu, such as all of that. But then you get the 4th type site. And this is the type site that's a little weird. This is one of the ones like Khirbet Ghozlan. These are exactly the same as that first one, what most sites look like, tiny scrappy bits of nothing. And yet they've got these weird enclosure systems around them. And this is the kind of site type that we're trying to explain. I'm not the first, of course. Excavators at Khirbet Ghozlan looked at the excavations of one of these enclosure sites, and they argued that it was the first order site in a settlement hierarchy, particularly for a settlement very close to it. Almost like an acropolis, if you will, controlling a hinterland of subservient sites. That, I'm not sure that flies. You've got a massive undefended 20-hectare settlement down in the Jordan Valley, which to me doesn't rest as an easy relationship. And you don't have those same relationships with the various other sites. Gaetano Palumbo, that early Bronze 4 person digging at Jebel Rahale, he looked at that site and said, well, it's right on the cusp between the sort of the desert and the Saône, the agricultural areas and the suboptimal zones of the Jordanian plateau. And he said, well, maybe it's a farming village, but they've enclosed it to protect it from incursions of raiding nomads. That old motif, if you like. I always think of nomads in the archaeological record of Donald Rumsfeld's Known Unknowns. And you may well be right, but it doesn't explain why many of the other sites, Khirbet Ghozlan in particular, for example, they're not located on that cusp at all. They're located in some of the most fertile areas in the country. So I think we've got to step back and look at the larger picture. And I think the key here is that all of those sites are upland sites. They don't exist in the littoral. They don't exist in the Jordan Valley. And the Jordan Valley, particularly before the construction of the canal, of course, the Jordan Valley would often flood. And olive trees need good drainage. They've got very woody roots. Those roots rot if it's poor drainage, which is why the Goldilocks zone, if you like, of olive horticulture is the sides of the Jordan Valley escarpment, not the Jordan Valley floor. And the fact that these are all in that Goldilocks zone said to me, well, maybe this enclosure site is something to do with upland horticulture. That perhaps people are harvesting their olives, storing their olive oil in these kind of bank vaults in the landscape, if you will, albeit temporary while the harvest is going on, and need it to be in a controlled point before they finish the harvest, and then the oil goes off distributed through the local settlement networks. That's kind of the hypothesis that we set out to test through excavations. Are these specialised production sites associated with the exploitation of upland horticultural crops for the production of high-value liquid commodities, if you want to dress it up in some fancy pants language? So what would we then need to look for if we're trying to see if this is something to do with olive oil horticulture or not? For that, we need to review what are the material signatures of olive oil production. Now, I realise, as an Australian, to be here talking to a group of people in this part of the world about olive oil production is about as ambitious as somebody from Hebrew University or Birzeit University going to the University of Sydney to talk about kangaroo colour. So yeah, I know. Bear with me. Tell me what I've got wrong. But there's basically, obviously, there are many pathways that you can harvest and press your olive. They basically come down to the following steps. First of all, there is, of course, the harvesting. The harvest has been traditionally done after the first winter rains have washed the summer dust off the fruit, or the first autumn rains have washed it off. The fruit is traditionally raked or shaken off onto ground sheets where it is sorted of the grubs, the twigs, the caterpillars, the stuff you don't want in your oil, and then crushed. And you can see crushed under big stones, such as this historic image on the left. These images in the middle and the right, they were taken a couple of years ago at one of the only heritage mills still working in Jordan, at a little village called Tubna in the eastern escarpment up sort of around the Ajloon hinterlands between Ajloon and Irbid. And it still uses, the roller is mechanized, but a large roller crushing not only the fruit, but the stones and everything within that fruit. That crushed fruit turns into a kind of peanut butter-like tapenade that is then smeared onto mats or pressed onto mats, stacked up, and of course, the oil then needs to be exuded out of that. In this case, at the Tubna mill by a mechanized vice, pressing it, you can see those sort of golden tears of oil dripping out the side. And I've got to say, putting a little teacup under and drinking that is one of the just magical things you can do. And of course, there are other ways, pre-mechanization of giving that force, usually by weight or pressing or by some sort of counterlever system. While we're talking about pressing, there are byproducts from the pressing, and this is important because after the oil has been exuded, the now much drier tapenade, if you like, it's removed from the mats so that the mats can be reused, as you can see here. But the guy on the right is shoveling that jift in Arabic. I'm not sure what the Hebrew is. Anyone? Jift. There we go. Into sacks because it's still got a lot of residual oil in it. It burns very well, so it can be used as fuel. It's often turned into bricks for fuel, used for animal feed, used for fertilizer. It's an important byproduct of the whole process. That oil nowadays on a highly functional mechanized mill is then sent around in a sort of centripetal force to separate residual water from the oil, and it's the pure oil that decants away. Historically, very often, that first pressing oil is stored in large vats where that residual water and oil separate by density for a few weeks until the water can be removed or the oil can be removed off the oil, and you have a much purer product. So what are the archaeological indices, the signatures, if you like, of olive oil production? Well, QNAF, National Geographic image, but it does the job. Pressing installations, stone cut, sort of pressing vats, weights, crushing equipment, decanting equipment, the collection jars, the pouring jars, all of that as you would expect. That image, though, is missing perhaps the most important thing. Anyone? The olives themselves, the archaeobotanical record. Either the olive pits or, more particularly, the crushed olive gift. And I think you put all of that together, and that's giving you that kind of assemblage of what olive oil production would look like in the archaeological record. So, back to Khirbet Ghozlan. So we're in the Wadi Rayyan. The Wadi Rayyan, by the way, used to be called the Wadi Yabas, which is kind of coming off an old biblical term for a site nearby called Jabesh Gilead, into Yabas. In Arabic, Yabas means barren, dry, arid. And in the 1990s, the Jordanian king went, well, this is ridiculous. This is the most fertile, verdant, beautiful wadi we have, particularly in the springtime when it's covered in flowers, which is frankly why I'm working there. We will call it the Wadi Rayyan, the verdant, the abundant. And so it lost the historical resonance, but a much more kind of accurate depiction, if you like, of the Wadi today. It receives some of the highest headwaters. Its headwaters receive some of the highest rainfall in Jordan. There's a perennial stream fed by several springs. And honestly, whenever I dig there in the spring, and I always dig there in the spring, it's just like being Julie Andrews in a Brackett into song. I first worked in the Wadi Rayyan when I was doing my PhD because along the ridge tops are covered in hundreds, and I know precisely how many hundreds because I surveyed them all, of these dolmen tombs. That was the subject of my PhD, which I've then published a book on. I will not bore you with the dolmens today, but I was particularly surveying one ridge called the ridgeline of Tel Arras. And you can see from this model, we were mapping out all the dolmens and other kind of megalithic structures such as cairns. This is the Khirbet Ghozlan knoll sticking out into the wadi, a very defensible position. But some of the yellow triangles were rock-cut features, many of which were olive presses. Now, some of them were perhaps wine presses or olive presses from the classical period, but the ones in this area overlooking the Ghozlan knoll look like the ones that I've got on the right. And you can see that these are fruit presses of some sort. They're cut into the silicified limestone. They've got a basin at the top, which is sort of 90 centimeters by 90 centimeters, I guess, give or take. And then you can see a channel cut through, or a drainage hole to a larger tank where not that it would collect the oil itself, but where you could wedge a collection jar underneath it. And I think it's hard to imagine, you know, a carefully constructed funnel out of leaves or a matting or something would funnel that oil straight into a jar. So the fruit going into the top, pressing it down, and then collecting the juice as it runs off the bottom. Now, if you stand on the Khirbet Ghozlan knoll here, protruding out into the Wadi Rayyan, and you face directly west, you're looking down the Wadi Rayyan to the Jordan Valley and the hills beyond. And then if you spin around 180 degrees and look due east, you look up the Wadi Rayyan to the hills of the Transjordan Plateau, and the Crusader Castle of Ajloun is just hidden by that hill in the foreground. I was always told when I was an undergraduate, if you're selecting a site to work, go somewhere near a pub. There's no pubs there. But the consolation prize it is remarkably good. I've done 3 seasons of excavations, or I should say we, because I've got an extremely good team. We've done 3 seasons of excavations. I can tell you now we will not be doing a 4th until I've published these 3. That is a commitment I've made to myself, to my team, and to the Jordanian Department of Antiquities. I think it's a very important one to honour. The first season we went out very briefly in 2017. The trenches we dug were in blue. We didn't even know. A large part of the site, particularly running up the middle, is exposed bedrock. And although it's covered in early Bronze 4 pottery, we didn't know if there would be anything there. Would it just be topsoil onto bedrock? It was very much an exploration. And what we found was that no, there's actually good architecture there, standing sort of 4 or 5 courses high with in situ vessels. So that was a quite nice first season. We then returned with a bit more funding and did a larger kind of exploration of the site. And then, of course, we sat on our hands like the rest of the world over COVID, and then managed to get back in early 2022 and concentrate particularly on this southern area of the site here. Now, I'm not going to go through the archaeology in any detail. I'm happy to do that with the archaeologists afterwards. However, I'll give you a quick overview and then look at the stuff that we found. So we can kind of divide the site into 3 areas, A, B, and C. No, I don't have any imagination either. Area A concerns that part of the site to do with that monumental portion of the enclosure wall. One of the questions we wanted to say was that, well, there's this big wall and there's early Bronze 4 pottery around the site, but was it built in the early Bronze 4 or was it a later or an earlier thing? And I think we can say quite definitively, because we've got in situ deposits on either side, that yeah, it's definitely part of this early Bronze 4 construction. And part of it, where that arrow is, you can see that there's large stones up to here. This, and it's hard to see from a top view, but this is quite a distinct edge. And all of these boulders have been laid down flat, like a monumental threshold, if you like. But it's not really a threshold into anything particularly substantial. It's a threshold into this room here. You can see through here with what I think is an animal feed trough. So I think this is just an animal pen. I think this is the way that when people are up there and they're bringing a herd of sheep, goats in for the evening, this is how they're bringing them into that enclosure, perhaps with, you know, bracken or thorny bushes that they then put across that threshold to close it off. If you look at the section, this is pretty typical deposit here for Khirbet Ghozlan. It's not a complex site to dig. We've got topsoil that overlies about 60, 70 centimeters of tumble from all the early Bronze 4 architecture. The site was clearly left standing, and then over the course of several centuries, it slowly tumbled in on itself. That tumble overlies the only occupation phase, and it's a single phase. There's no rebuilding of architecture. There's no superimposed floors upon floors upon floors. This is a single period site in the briefest possible way of conceiving that. Rooms have 1 floor, no rebuilds or anything like that. And then that occupation surface either directly overlies bedrock, directly overlies the natural soil, or in places it overlies a levelling fill that's been brought in to prepare the site. And that level of preparation is important, because we'll come back to that in just a moment. Area B, slightly south towards that, contained a couple of larger buildings. You can see the largest here. Comprises kind of 2 types of rooms, if you like. Large open rooms into which are embedded grindstones, and that preparation here, you can see where that grindstone has been nestled into undulating bedrock. Leveling fill has been put in against it right up to the lip, then the surface has been smoothed off on top. So this is a really well prepared, albeit scrappy kind of site. And these kind of open areas with the grindstones we found in other places in the site as well. And these are the rooms in which we found most of our storage jars, all stacked up, top against each other, sitting on the surface, crushed by the tumble, but all intact or mostly intact within these sorts of rooms here. And then smaller kind of storage bin, storage featurey kind of stuff. And I've called this building a storehouse, if you want, because almost all the pottery is storage wares, including those in situ vessels. There's virtually no things like cooking pots or anything coming out of that, although we get that from other places in the site. And we had caches of stone tools and pounders of stuff all kind of squirreled away within the architecture there. You can see another room kind of developing on that other side. If you stand back and look at that more fully, can you see that wall that it's built against? This whole area is sandwiched between a long exposed piece of exposed bedrock, all like the spine of the site, and a retaining wall that's been built on the other side. So you've got bedrock here, and then they built a retaining wall to kind of create a triangular section onto which they've leveled the whole place. Now, the key relationship is that retaining wall abuts the inside of that enclosure wall. So in other words, you can look at that and go, okay, how did our guys turn up and build our IKEA olive oil factory? First of all, they got to the knoll, and the first thing they did was enclose it. The first thing they did. Then they built a retaining wall to create a distinct section, and then they built the architecture within that, which abuts the inside of the retaining wall. So you can see that there is an order of operations, a process. This was a deliberately conceived plan of the site. It's not something that's grown organically. And on a strip trench, we picked up the trace of what I think could be the return of that wall, but it was so shallow it's a bit hard to tell. But if so, then we've got a whole unit within that retaining wall, creating this kind of storehouse unit, if you like. Now jump south of that, and it's very different. The archaeology smells different, the assemblage smells different. And what we've got, I think, is the domestic area. This is the places where people were living while they were up there. And again, there's not a huge build-up of deposits or anything. They're single floors. But essentially, we've got a courtyard accessed by a streetway between two buildings. And then, can you see this kind of rubble through here? It's a very different sort of wall. It's a whole series of radiating walls extending out, within which rubble has been piled, almost like a casemate. And that wall, if you go by the surface mounded rubble, actually encircles this entire thing, where we can see it emerging again. I think we've just got a ring of domestic rooms surrounding an interior courtyard. I think this is the kind of just the squatting normal living area for anyone who's up there. So, in summary, it's a preconceived settlement. It's a single phase. And what perhaps is most significant is that there's no ash. There's no build-up of rubbish. There's no build-up of debris. I mean, we are a messy species, aren't we? And none of that is there. It's a very clean site. Artifacts are there, the storage jars are there, but all the debris, the detritus, the animal bones left over from people's meals, I'll go into all that in a minute, they fit into a couple of bags. There's hardly anything. I was digging a tell site at, say, Pella, where I cut my archaeological teeth. I would find at Pella in one morning, in an early Bronze Age trench, the same number of animal bones that we found in 3 seasons. It's a really distinct, different sort of signature. So what do we make of all that? How do we then interpret that according to this hypothesis of a specialised olive oil factory? Well, multiple strands of evidence upon which we need to draw. And I think the most important is the archaeobotanical evidence. First up, there's not much of it. We did flotation of every single early bronze for context we got to underneath that tumble. That's quite a lot by now. That's all been analysed by Dr. Caroline Cartwright. Caroline is a senior research scientist at the British Museum, an old colleague of mine, and one of the world's leading experts on wood and organic identification under scanning electron microscopy. We also took charcoal samples, all of which Caroline has looked at. There's not much, but what there is, I think, is compelling. First of all, the wood charcoal. You can see here from a couple of the trenches, when we were digging and you would find a bit of charcoal that you could see, macro sampling, we would, without touching it, making sure none of the guys were around smoking cigarettes, lever it out of the soil into some foil, packaged up as a sample, and Caroline would look at that wood under the microscope. What were they burning for fuel, basically? 3 different planes. And I remember Caroline was actually visiting me when I was in Sydney at one point. And I knew she had all these samples to look through. I knew that she's also one of the busiest people I know. I took her out for dinner in a Thai restaurant around the University of Sydney. I didn't feel like I could ask her if she'd done the samples yet. And she kept me going the entire meal. And it wasn't until we were having dessert. She said, "You've been very good, Jamie. You haven't asked me if I've done your sample." "Oh, you're very busy, Caroline. I know that you'll get to it when you have time." She said, "Well, I have. I've done all of your samples. And you know what? You've got olive wood there. They're burning olive wood." And I went, "That's fantastic. That's exactly what I was hoping to hear." And she went, no, listen to me. They're only burning olive wood. I've never seen this before. This assemblage is not dominated. It's exclusively olive wood charcoal. And that's quite extraordinary. This is what olive wood charcoal looks like under the scanning electron microscope. The big rent in this one is caused by heat. Beautiful, beautiful, gorgeous, sexy images, I think. However, maybe Caroline's got to me. And in addition, Caroline also went through all the wood charcoal coming out of soil flotation, really small, scrappy, fly-papery bits of stuff. And she found many of these kind of small shoots or saplings, the green kind of wood that you wouldn't normally burn. But that's there too. And what I think is going on, and what Caroline thinks is going on, is we're looking at orchard prunings. These are the prunings stockpiled by people while they're harvesting their olives or during a different pruning kind of period, and then they're stockpiled. Because why go and source a whole bunch of new wood if you've already got a pile of it there? Plus, of course, olive wood burns very, very well. And it makes sense, I think. Now, the other thing, of course, that Caroline got out of all the flotation was, and I think this is really a beautiful image, but I know this is only a mother could love it. This is a piece of gypsum. This is a crushed olive stone. And that was there, not only from 1 or 2 samples, from every single sample had scraps, not much, but fragments of these crushed olive stones, this byproduct. So the smoking gun, or the smoking GNU for any Terry Pratchett fans, I think showcasing that olive pressing was happening at the site. Now, for the first 2 seasons, when we're digging in areas A and B, so against the wall, in the animal pen, and the storage compound, that's all we got. It wasn't until we started digging the domestic residence that the spectrum of the archaeobotanical assemblage started to grow. And there we got just a few examples, a couple of bits of battered wheat, a couple of bits of battered lentils, not much, but it's there. Overwhelmingly, 95, 98% of the assemblage is still olive, Olea europaea, but there are other species present. Of course there are. People still have to eat. What you're looking at here is a fig seed, and the one on the right is from the Ziziphus berry. And Ziziphus trees grow wild up in the escarpment. There's one growing right next to the site right now, and just as the shepherds do today, they can be harvested at the same time as olives are harvested, stored and eaten. And in fact, this example comes from several that were found within the same storage jar. So just people using what is to hand at the time. Both these fruit at the same time as olives, so it could help our kind of seasonality argument, although both, of course, can be dried and stored. So I wouldn't go too long on that one. Now, I'm just going to compare that very quickly to another site called Tel Abu Niyaj, which is down here. Can you see where that is? Right on the Jordan Valley floor. Tel Abu Niyaj is an early Bronze Age or, so same period, agro-pastoral village. It is absolutely bog standard what you would expect a village to look like, where people are living all the time, they're farming their fields, they're farming with their herds, all of that sort of stuff. And more to the point, it's been published and well published by Patricia Fall and Pat Falconer, including all the archaeobotany, including all the archaeozoology. It is our comparanda to look at this difference between upland and lowlands of sites that were occupied at the same time. Although Niyaj has 6 periods of occupation spanning a large part of the period. Now, the key point here is that the archaeobotanical signature is different. It matters at Ghozlan that only olive wood was found, because it's, to me, it says that they're not bothering to search out wild taxa. And if you look at Niyaj, which is the 4th column, sure, they're burning orchard taxa, they're burning wood from their orchards, mostly from fig down in the Jordan Valley, remember, but they're harvesting whatever, there's shrubs, there's trees, there's a broad spectrum of wood. It also matters that no charred seeds were found at Ghozlan. By that I mean the wild grasses, all that sort of stuff, because that gets into the archaeological record when animals eat them and then they defecate and dung is dried and used as fuel. And that's all there at Abu Niyaj. But it's not up there at all at Ghozlan, because no one is burning dung if they're burning the orchard prunings. In fact, you can see at Niyaj, there's wild species, the grasses, pulses, lentils and all that. There's a lot of cereals, the wheat, the barleys, those sorts of grain, as well as the orchard taxa, some olives, mostly fig. But that huge spectrum, that different varied assemblage is not there at Ghozlan. Moving quickly on to the lithics, Francesca Manclosi is our lithicist. She's doing a wonderful job. Most of the lithics there are sort of ad hoc, standard kind of stuff used from the local flint, except for these Canaanian blades. And if you look carefully at many of them, along the same axis, they're notched. Not all of them, but many of them. The same point. And to me, that suggests they were hafted, and I wonder if we've got our early bronze for pruning saw. We'll see. Faunal remains, there's virtually nothing there. This isn't a random sample. This is the diagnostics from the early bronze 4 level. This is it. And this is all I've got to show you. It's a whole lot of undiagnostic stuff as well. Mostly sheep, goat, a couple of bits of cattle, but there's really not a lot of rubbish around there at all. Pottery is pretty bog standard early bronze 4. It's got the whole kind of assemblage that you would wish to see. Marta D'Andrea, La Sapienza, is our ceramicist. The difference here is proportions, because most of the pottery, we're looking 80, 84, 85%, is dominated by storage jars, either kind of whole mouth storage jars here or tall narrow neck storage jars like this. And again, the pots are often found kind of semi-complete, but all crushed. So it's, and early bronze 4 pottery, I mean, it takes a run up to love this sort of stuff. And our poor conservator was going crazy trying to put some of it together, but you know, she's got so far. You can see some of the pot lids we found as well, which sit quite neatly on those whole mouth jars. And in addition to those, we also got several of these sorts of examples. These are open sort of jars like this, with a spout coming off the top. Now they're spouted vats, teapots, call them what you will, but if they were filled with liquid, to have the spout at the very top, it makes it cumbersome to sort of pick up and pour. I think in this case, anyway, we're looking at our decanting vats. Because if you left oil in that, you put it somewhere in a small room, dark, such as the storage complex, and let that oil settle for a few weeks, then you've got the oil rising to the top over the water, and it's very easy to decant off or even pour water in to decant this much purer oil off. And this is what it looks like with some fabulous drawings by our own Nadia Knudsen here. Neck storage jars, whole mouth storage jars, overwhelmingly dominating the assemblage. We've done some lipid residue analysis. This is Lisa Briggs, Dr. Lisa Briggs at the British Museum, who came in field, took samples from some of these crushed store jars from their base, from their spout, from the attendant soil as well. Now, I'm not going to go into the science of this because I'm afraid my brain isn't big enough. But Lisa, whose brain is, says that, yeah, we've got the index for degraded vegetable lipids. That is the kind of the signal that these jars held vegetable fats, i.e. olive oil, which I think is a pretty good bolster in the case as well. So, step back now. What have we got to suggest that this is a specialised horticultural site? Well, back to our process, we've got evidence for harvesting because I think we've got the burnt prunings. We've got evidence for the crushing, quite obviously, in the burned gift, and perhaps in the multiple numbers of sort of crushing grinders in place throughout the site. We do have the presses. They're all in the rock cut sort of bedrock around the site. We can't date them. They're impossible to date, but they're there, and they all have a very clear kind of proximity to the site. I think we've got evidence for filtering in these so-called decanting vats, and we've absolutely got evidence for storage in the store jars themselves, the proportion of storage wares at the site, and the fact that these jars have got the degraded residues of vegetable fats associated with olea europaea, associated with olive oil. So I think the case is pretty compelling that this is a specialised industrial site. You throw on to that the absence of evidence, and it gets even stronger. Now, the absence of evidence is always a tricky thing in archaeology. Is it not there because it's not there, or is it not there because you haven't found it, or is it not there because you found it and you just have been an idiot and not realised? I mean, it could be any of those sorts of things. But putting aside the fact that I could very well be an idiot, I think we can say these sorts of things. There is a limited occupation. There are single surfaces, there's very little ash, almost no animal bones. At the time I wrote this no cereal, we've now got a couple of examples of wheat, and that's it. You know, it's a single architectural phase as well. This is not a site that has been occupied for any long amount of time. So how do we interpret that? How do we put all this together? Well, okay, so we've got Khirbet Ghozlan up in the Jordan Valley escarpment. I don't think people are living there all year round. I think they're coming there seasonally. I think they're coming there sort of October, November, probably from sites like Tel Abyad down in the Jordan Valley, although we can't prove that yet. And they're coming up to harvest olives from the extant orchards growing up in the escarpment at sites like Wadi Rayyan. And this sort of accords well with, say, the Gezer calendar, 10th century BC inscription that is a wonderful description of the kind of the cadence of rural life, that you spend 2 months gathering olives in October, November. You go back for pruning in summer. And I think this is part of that seasonal landscape. This is what a seasonal site looks like in a larger kind of rural landscape that is the early Bronze floor. And this is how things work today. This is an olive factory at Kufrabil. It's less than 2 kilometers from the site of Khirbet Ghozlan in Jordan. And for 10 months of the year, it looks like this. It's closed, it's locked up, the lights are off, its equipment is stored under plastic. And then around the middle of October, the lights come on, the equipment gets whirred up, and everyone at the same time brings their olives to the mazra, to the factory for pressing, because everyone needs their oil all at once. And it's some of the most dynamic, vibrant, lively places anywhere in Jordan, working late into the night, early in the morning to try and get through all the olives for the hinterland during the harvest season. And then when it winds up, it's locked up again and left for the next 10 months or so. And I think that's a very good analogy as to how we should interpret Khirbet Ghozlan. Why does all this matter? Why do we care? Well, we care about this for a couple of reasons. And the first of it is, this is giving us a really good window, I think, into looking at what happens in the rural landscape in this so-called dark age after the kind of urban zenith of the EB1, EB2. So when these cities rise, part of their ascension is done on the back of the olive oil trade with Egypt. Now, maybe these cities collapsed because that olive trade dried up, or maybe that olive oil trade dried up because these cities have collapsed. It's a chicken and egg scenario. But what this is showing us is, well, what happens to these industries that are supporting this international trade when you strip the international trade away? We're looking at a reconfiguration of the rural landscape at this time as these industries become much more local. But they're really important to understand because, of course, these urban processes, these urban sinews, if you like, get reconstituted in the early to mid-second millennium BC, Middle Bronze Age, and the maintenance of these horticultural industries are part of that springboard upon which that urban recovery occurs, which is why I think we really need to understand what's going on, how these things are still knitting together various networks of settlements during this period of collapse. But ultimately, why I think this sort of project is important is because it's taking a site that doesn't get a lot of attention, a really small site. I mean, if you had surveyed Khirbet Ghozlan, you would be classified as a kind of village or even a hamlet or a farmstead because it's so small. The enclosure wall is the only thing that sets it apart. And you go to one of these small sites, particularly in an area that doesn't get a lot of archaeological attention, such as the escarpment of the Jordan Valley on the east side, and you approach it with some robust questions, and you build into that a program of scientific investigation with the right scientists at the right time, I think that small site can actually have quite a large story to tell on these larger leitmotifs of urbanism, urban collapse, and urban rejuvenation, if approached in the right way. And that's certainly what we've been working up towards now. In a couple of weeks, I go back to Jordan for, at the end of March, in February, I go back to Jordan for a couple of weeks. Nadia and a few other colleagues. We're finishing the last post-excavation stuff, and then it's right into publication phase. So we can get out what I've just talked about before we go back and do any more digging. So thank you very much.